Welcome. Do you want to win games faster? Try this trick from the Queen's Gambit. Without further ado, let's get to the point. What is the goal of an opening? It is to develop your pieces, such as your knights, bishops, castle, and to control the center of the board, the middle of the board. How do you do that? Well, in order to achieve that goal, usually the first move is going to be either e4 or d4 because that's how you actually start controlling the center right away. And if we take a look at the move d4, which is clearly one of the oldest and most well-known chess openings, here there is a little advantage of d4 compared to e4. From here, the d4 pawn is already defended by the queen. So it can never be blundered, and for that reason, the Queen's Gambit is a more solid, more risk-free opening, and more positional players usually love playing this. Now, after d4, ideally speaking, white would love to take the center fully by playing e4 on the next move. Let's say if black plays some random move, we're gonna play e4. And now just look at how many squares white starts controlling. Now white took the center, which gave white also a lot of additional squares that they control. Also, by moving the pawns forward, we gave some more breathing space for the pieces standing behind them, and now they also started to be involved even from their original squares. I've just marked all the squares that white's pieces are controlling, and you see that it's pretty much the entire board, and white achieved that within just 2 moves. So, that's the power of taking the center. For that reason, normally black does not want to let white accomplish their plan and will counteract white in their attempt to play pawn e4. Black has 2 main options. Either to play the move d5 so that the pawn takes control of this square, or to bring their knight to f6, where the knight will take control of that square. So, these are the 2 main moves of black, either d5 or knight f6. d5 has been known for over 500 years and is known as the Queen's Gambit after white's move, pawn c4. But once again, what's the point? Why should I play this move, pawn c4? Why not just develop simply with knight f3, knight c3, and so on? Well, if you develop like that, there is nothing wrong with it, but you don't get any advantage. Black will develop just as well. So, how do you get an advantage? Again, let's look back at our first idea, that you need to fight for the center. How do you do that? Now, we currently have a completely equal situation in the center. To challenge black in the center, white can try playing knight c3 followed by e4, and if white could accomplish that, they would indeed get greater influence over central squares. But the problem here is that black can counteract this very easily just by playing a somewhat symmetric move, knight f6, and they're also providing one more defense to the square. If black ever needs to, they can also play bishop f5 and control that way. So, although white wants to play e4, they can't really achieve that, and thus knight c3 does not really bring the result that white is hoping for. This brought white to think about, okay, let's try to undermine black's center from the other side by playing c4 and attacking the center that way. And that starts the Queen's Gambit, as we are gambiting the pawn. In fact, black can't retain that pawn anyway, so it's not really a gambit. Again, d4 is a more classical, more solid, risk-free opening, so you're not even sacrificing the pawn. Really, you're sacrificing it just for a moment, for a move or two, because you're going to get it back. Now let's look at black's options. White's idea is pretty clear. They want to eliminate this pawn, which will give them an advantage in the center. So that's the reason behind the move pawn c4. What can black do now? We'll start from some popular options, although not the most popular ones, and then gradually climb to the main lines of the Queen's Gambit. There are a couple of interesting things here, and the first question, of course, is, why not just take this pawn and get a pawn advantage? What's going to happen in that case? Some interesting things start happening right here. Just after these 2 moves are played, it's white's move currently. The easiest thing you can do is just to take this pawn back as soon as you can by playing pawn to e3. Preparing to capture this pawn right on the next move. Black usually should give up this pawn and let you capture it on the next move. But if black tries to hold on to this pawn by playing pawn to b5, and you'll be astonished to see that it's the second most played move in this position, with, if I'm not mistaken, around 200,000 players attempting it, although it's an old trap. Many players still fall right into it. The problem here is that, although it defends this pawn, white can undermine the whole pawn structure, and black cannot defend it. If black takes here, it just breaks up all their pawns, and white can pick them off easily. So, this does not help black keep their pawn advantage. If black tries pawn to a6, that fails to another tactic here. After pawn a6, white can just capture and take advantage of the pin, meaning black cannot recapture. Or else they would lose the rook on a8, which is pretty cool. Now finally, if your opponent calculates this line and sees that pawn a6 doesn't work, they might come to the conclusion that they can defend this pawn just by playing pawn to c6. After an exchange, it looks like black maintained their material advantage. And everything seems fine, but there's a twist. After queen to f3, white is hitting the rook, and there is no way for the rook to escape. This is a trap you can use effectively against many of your opponents, as you get a decisive material advantage as early as move 6, approaching the main lines of the queen's gambit. So the main line here is the move pawn a6. We already know that, ideally speaking. Black wants to maintain their presence in the center, so they don't want to give up their center. And then the question is, how do you defend that pawn? You can do that in two different ways. It's either playing c6, the Slav defense, or playing e6 instead of that, which is the queen's gambit. Now, if you play both moves, they have certain drawbacks, although they both are perfectly good and perfectly playable. When black goes pawn c6, that does defend this pawn but takes away the normal square c6 from black's knight, and that's a drawback. In contrast to this, when black goes pawn e6, again, he defends the pawn, but that blocks out the light square bishop, so it cannot be developed anymore, and it's a little bit passive. That's a drawback of this move. But again, that said, both moves are perfectly fine. What does white usually do after that? Well, simply develop. Actually, you don't even need to know too much theory here. You just develop. So you play knight c3, for example, knight f6, and after that, just bishop g5, pawn e3. White needs to play e3 in order to bring this bishop out from f1. But before playing e3, it's better to bring this bishop out. Because, let's take this move back, if you play e3 right away, then yes, it does develop this one, but the bishop on c1 is kind of locked. It can't get out, so for that reason, instead of e3 right away, it's better to bring the bishop out first and only then play e3, and you just develop. After that, black usually goes bishop e7 to neutralize this pin, and then again, white just develops. Knight f3, castles, pawn e3, just bishop d3, castling. White simply plays the most natural developing moves, and that is it. So that is the most classical variation of the queen's gambit. That said, if you do not want to study any opening theory and you want to keep it simple for yourself, that's all for today. In the next part we will discuss in more depth about this gambit. Thanks for watching.